Begin recording. I think we should be. Thank you. That came in loud and clear. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for this morning. Victor Asal is director of the Center for Policy Research and a professor of political science at the University of Albany. His research focuses on non-state actor violence and the causes of political discrimination, particularly related to ethnicity and gender. He also researches interactive pedagogy in comparative politics and in international relations. Brian Phillips is an associate professor in the Department of Government at the University of Essex and an affiliated professor at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics in Mexico City. His research focuses on subnational violence, including terrorism, civil conflict, organized crime, and the dynamics of violent groups. And Karl Rethemeyer is Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and is a faculty member in the School of Public Policy. His primary research interest is in social networks, their impact on social, political, and policy processes, and the methods used to study such networks. I'm pleased to point out that all three authors have been long-term affiliates with the START Center. Their presentation this morning is titled Insurgent Terrorism, Intergroup Relationships, and the Killing of Civilians. Their presentation coincides with the release of a new book from the authors that's coming out very soon by the same name. I was able to get an advance copy of the book and it's excellent. I encourage all of you to look for the book and order your copies as soon as you're able to. I'm also delighted to point out that this is the latest book published through a collaboration between START and the University of Oxford Press, an arrangement that started now more than 7 years ago. This is the fourth published book in the series, and there are several more in the pipeline. And along these lines, I want to give a shout out to Gary Ackerman, Tony Lemieux, and Laura Dugan, who are currently the editorial board for the START Oxford series. I'm not sure if any of them are on this call, but anyway, wanted to recognize them. We've also asked the authors to spend about 30 to 40 minutes on their presentation, and we plan to have some time for questions afterwards. So as I say, just any questions that come up, feel free to drop them into the chat, and we'll try to include as many of them as we can. So with that, I'm not sure which order you all want to go in, but we can lead off with the presentation.
Sounds good to me. I'm going to take the first crack, and then I believe it's Karl, and then Brian. Sorry, other way around. But let me put my screen up, and hopefully everyone can see that. Can everybody see my okay. So just an outline. I'll be talking about the background to the data and how this got started, and then also Brian will be talking about theory and the main results, and Karl will be talking about network modeling. So how this got started. So this got started when I was a new professor and Karl was a almost new professor at UAlbany. We chatted in the hallway. We decided to go to Savrana's, which is a local pizza place that I highly recommend if you ever come to Albany, New York. And we were sitting eating pizza, and we discussed our interests. My interests were, one of my main interests was terrorism and why people blow people up, and particularly civilians. And Karl was an expert in this thing I had never really heard about before called social network analysis. And we got together and collected data for the Big Allied and Dangerous, that's the name of the data set, one which focused on 395 terrorist organizations from 98 to 2005. And then we got some resources, including from START, so thank you very much. And START has had a huge impact on our ability to do this research. To collect yearly data, we started with insurgent organizations, because that way we could actually collect the data within the time frame that we had. Then there was this guy who was an outside reader, me, on a student's dissertation, and the dissertation was brilliant. And we started writing papers together with this guy, and it ended up in a book. And this guy was Brian Phillips. So that's how we made these connections. Now, in terms of the book, the key question and the key motivation, there are a lot of people who argue that terrorist organizations kill civilians because they don't have the ability to engage in battle. If I don't really have the ability to kill a bunch of soldiers, it's very easy to blow up a bus. So that's the easier route. But the fact is that insurgent organizations are organizations that can and do kill soldiers. And so that's why they're called insurgent organizations and not terrorist organizations. But some of these organizations do kill civilians. So if organizations that have the ability to kill soldiers are still killing civilians, what is the motivating factor? Why is this happening? And it's important to note, some people say, well, all insurgent organizations do this. No, they don't. Some do it every year, some do it occasionally, and some insurgent organizations never kill civilians. They basically focus, or at least they never, not that we can tell. And so our focus of the book is, why do insurgent organizations who have the ability to kill soldiers, why do some of them kill civilians? So for example, the Islamic State, or ISIS, has the ability, or had the ability, to kill a lot of soldiers. In 2007, they killed 3,600 soldiers, an insurgent group. But at the same time, they were slaughtering lots of civilians. So what are the factors that would make an organization has the capability to fight in a civil war and be on the ground fighting soldiers? Why are they killing these civilians? And as we discuss later, and we'll discuss later, by we, I mean Karl, the impact of embeddedness, the extent to which an insurgent organization is enmeshed in relationships with the state and other groups and the public, is one of the key factors impacting this behavior. So relationships really matter here, along with some other things that Brian is going to talk about as well. So key concepts, because people argue sometimes vociferously about what these different terms mean. So we are seeing an insurgent organization as a non-state actor that competes within a state in a civil conflict and kills soldiers. Okay, it's not just killing civilians. Terrorist organization, and primarily soldiers. Terrorist organization, and breaks the bar that has been set by the UCDP data set that is out there. Terrorist organizations are a group that primarily use terrorism, though what terrorism is highly debated. We define terrorism as the intentional attack of civilians by non-state or state actors. And in this case, we're focusing on insurgent organizations that attack civilians and not the military or government security forces. They could also attack security or military forces, but that's not how we're measuring terrorism. Terrorism is when they're actually attacking civilians. And so we're focusing on civilians as victims. And it's important to differentiate terrorism from more traditional insurgent violence. And once we get to questions, if anybody has any questions about this, we'll be happy to answer. Now, our previous research has focused on this question. Sorry, there is previous research that is focused on this question. Several people have argued that a type of regime, if they're fighting a democracy, then insurgents are more likely to attack civilians. Some people have argued that if an insurgent organization is weak, they're more likely to attack civilians. And some have argued that territorial control can impact whether you attack civilians, including the area that the group might be tied to related to ethnic connections, as well as interinsurgent violence can lead to civilian targeting. So there has been some analysis of this, and these are the kinds of answers that people have come up with so far. Now, the data we're using to do this is the Big Alley and Dangerous 2, Bad 2 insurgency data. This data collects group attributes yearly from 1998 to 2012. We've got data for 140 organizations for 15 years yearly, 1,386 years. I will note that the number of organizations has shifted over the years. So for example, in 1998, there were 76 organizations, in 2003, 91 organizations, and in 2012, 107 organizations. And as I noted before, START, I don't know if Gary Lefree has ever heard of START, but START has funded this research. So number of insurgent organizations by groups, and you can see that there are huge differences in terms of the number of insurgent organizations that are out there, in terms of the number of groups that are active, with sub-Saharan Africa and Asia having by far the largest, MENA having a lot, and the Americas, meaning North and South America, and Europe having by far fewer number of insurgent organizations. Note, again, this doesn't cover organizations that only use terrorism. This covers insurgent organizations, and most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, or the Middle East and North Africa. Now, how long do the groups last in the data? Some organizations last for a year, but a lot of the organizations, as you can see, have last throughout the entire time period. So some of these organizations last for quite a while. Now, again, we said some use terrorism all the time. So around 20 groups use it all the time. A whole bunch, more than 80, use it sometimes, but not every year. And a whole bunch never use it. And so it's really an interesting question. Not every non-state actor using violence actually does this. So does it kill civilians? So what is that key factor that puts groups here or in the middle, or using it every year? And this is a looking at, for each group, how often do they use terrorism, i.e. kill civilians on a regular basis. And you can see there's a huge spread. And so what we're really looking here for is, what are the factors that are making this happen? And you can see, for example, in terms of these organizations, they really have really huge differences in terms of size. So there are more than 20 organizations that have more than 10,000 people in them. There are almost 80 organizations that have between 1,000 and 9,999 people. There are almost 40 that have between 100 and 999. And there are very, very few organizations that are doing this. They're considered insurgent organizations. Still, it's not a lot. Most organizations have 100 or more people in them. So our dependent variable, the key dependent variable here, is terrorism. It's a dichotomous variable in much of our analysis, coded as a 1. If in that year we see that an organization has killed civilians, and a 0 if it has not. Only a minority of group years, a grand total of 40%, actually kill civilians in that specific year. For some, we use a binary analysis. For others, we use a count analysis. And we do some other work that looks at military and police targets. So not just terrorism in our general analysis. I have 30 seconds left, so I will briefly just note, we use a lot of different independent variables to try and explain this. We use state strategy. Are they trying to make a deal? Carrot. Are they trying to smack them and hurt them and kill them? Stick, or mixed? Do network relations have an impact on how they behave? So if I have a lot of friends, allies, does that have an impact? Or do I have a lot of enemies? Does that have an impact? Ideology might have an impact, and there's a lot of literature on ideology and terrorism. So we're looking at ethnic ideology, religious ideology, leftist ideology, their activity. Did they use terrorism in the past? How many people are they killing on the battlefield? Are they involved in crime or social services? The size of the organization, their territorial control, what kind of leadership they have, the impact of state terror in society in general on their behavior, the level of democracy, GDP per capita, and population. And now I'm going to turn it over to someone else.
Thanks, Victor. Let me go ahead and share my version of the slides. Great. Hello, everybody. And again, thanks. And thanks to Gary, to Aaron, to everybody at START. It's great to be with you all today. So Victor provided a great introduction to what we're doing here, how we got started. I'm going to discuss this particular argument, insurgent embeddedness in particular. And with this idea, and some of this might overlap a little bit with Victor's, but we know a lot of work looking at civil war, a lot of work at terrorism. A lot of this emphasizes relationships just between the state and the insurgents, overlooking other types of interactions. And the sort of classic Civil War literature from about 20 years ago really focuses on the state and the militant group. But then within the past 10 years or so, other work by scholars here and others has taken a step away from parsimony more towards nuance, looking at relationships among militant groups, rebel fragmentation, work by Cunningham and others. So there's more and more this type of work that's happening that we find interesting and relevant. And we build on some of that work in the paper. But we also look more broadly in a couple of ways that I'll describe. And we refer to this idea of incorporating multiple types of relationships as insurgent embeddedness, which we describe as the extent to which an insurgent organization or group is enmeshed in relationships with the state, other insurgents, and the public. And here's a graphic from the book, little sneak preview until you're able to buy it. And here we see that the sort of classic view of civil conflict is the state versus the insurgent group. And then in the middle, you have approaches that do take into consideration multiple types of actors, in this case, multiple insurgent groups and insurgents and interactions among them. And the third view on the far right is what we're thinking about, where we think about the broader embeddedness, not only of insurgent groups interacting with each other and interacting with the state, but also the role of the public, and work on rebel governance, for example, by Megan Stewart, by Anna Arjona, Nanfili, and others. Paul Staniland is helpful as well to think about this broader notion of embeddedness, and that's what we're building on in the paper. And so we introduce a number of hypotheses looking at, and this overlaps with Victor's, concessions. Is a government giving concessions towards a group? Is a government using coercion against the group? This is a relationship with the government that should be relevant, but also are there group relationships, alliances among insurgent organizations, rivalry among insurgent organizations? And then what we think of as relationships with the public. Does the insurgent group provide social services? Does it have an ethnic motivation, which should indicate a certain type of closeness with the public, identifiability of potential recruits and potential donors? And also, is the group involved in crime, which is another way to indicate a certain type of relationship with the public, often a predatory relationship with the public. And then we look at multiple types of civilian targeting as the outcomes. The overall idea of the book is looking at civilian targeting, is looking at terrorism. That's our primary dependent variable. But we also look at, one of the advances, I think, of the book is looking at different types of civilian targeting, terrorism against what we call the general public, which some sort of 1970s definitions of terrorism talk about terrorism as this ideal type that strikes fear into the heart of the general public, that any random citizen thinks that they could be next. But not a lot of measurement of terrorism looks at this particular type of terrorism, which we think is not only a measurement issue, but is conceptually a distinct or extreme type of terrorism. So we have a chapter looking at this, terrorism against the general public. So no government employees at all included, because that could indicate the state. No business leaders, religious leaders, leaders of any type. It's sort of your average citizens is what we're trying to capture. We also look at terrorism against schools, against educational facilities. There's really very little research on this topic. We would encourage more people to study this. So we looked at an entire chapter on this. And also terrorism against journalists. Of course, there is some work. Anita Godes and Sabina Carey and others, Viridiana Rios and Bradley Holland have done some work looking at violence against journalists. And there are NGOs working on this, but there's just not enough research. So we have a chapter on this as well. So again, overall, these additional chapters are not just different measurements of civilian targeting or different measurements of terrorism, but important subcategories of civilians who are targeted. And in the book, we think about what is the logic behind the targeting of these civilians in particular, and how might that logic be different compared to the logic behind civilian targeting as terrorism in general, as it's usually described. And then to get into a little bit about why does it matter to focus on schools or educational facilities, we think about different types of targets, which you can sort into hard targets, soft targets, conflict involved, conflict uninvolved, relatively uninvolved. And when we think about where are civilians here, of course, civilians are not hard targets who are conflict involved usually. It's the military and other security forces. So then among these other three cells, there's heterogeneity among civilians, different targets that insurgents might attack during a conflict. And we think that soft targets who are relatively conflict uninvolved should be pretty interesting as sort of a unique or extreme type of targeting. And so that's one reason why we think schools are so interesting to look at, because insurgent organizations really should not be attacking schools. Aside from Geneva Convention's prohibitions, normative ideas, this is an unusual type of targeting. So terrorism, as it's usually defined, could include all three boxes there, but we thought it was interesting to look at schools in particular for this reason. And so this is a sort of a big table, too much going on here, but if you want to see one of the main takeaways of the book, these are our main results across the different chapters. And I'll focus on one column at a time. But I'll come back to this big table if people are interested. And what we see here is with the main models, chapter 4, attacks on civilians or terrorism, as it's often described, we see that the relationships we suggest find support, whether we measure it in counts of terrorist attacks, dichotomous terrorism, civilian targeting, or even if we use a general GTD measure of terrorism as defined by GTD, we find a lot of support, robust support for this idea that government concessions reduce civilian targeting, while government repression and these other relationship measures are associated with increased subsequent civilian targeting. And interestingly, an alternate explanation, democracy, we don't find support for. It's really not related to civilian targeting by these insurgent organizations. Attacks on the general public, though, individuals who are not working for the government or leaders, we see some different results here, where government repression, rivalry, and ethnic motivation are associated with attacks on the general public. And I think that's mostly intuitive, but I'm happy to discuss that, or if there are thoughts on that, we can discuss it more. Democracy is also related to attacks on the general public, which might make sense. Attacks on schools, we see that government repression, alliances, and social services are associated with attacks on schools. This might raise some questions. Why is this? What's going on here? In the chapter, we speculate on why we might be seeing this, but more research really would be helpful, whether qualitative or micro-analyses with a particular group or country. This is something that I think is ripe for future research. And somewhat similarly with attacks on journalists, which are somewhat rare, but we see that almost none of the relationship measures, almost none of the models, none of the variables we're looking at in these models are related to attacks on journalists. Attacks on journalists are a somewhat unique and unusual type of violence, apparently. But one thing that we find really robustly related to attacks on journalists is alliances among among insurgent organizations. And this raises some questions about the specific causal mechanism. Is this because of tactical diffusion, learning among insurgent organizations? Is this because of increased capacity, makes them able to attack other journalists, or is there some other causal mechanism? We think there's evidence for a diffusion effect, that there could be diffusion among insurgent organizations where they see some other group getting benefits from attacking journalists. And so it spreads from one group to another, across borders, one country to another. But this is also something that we think really should be studied more. So feel free to do so and cite us. But overall, these are just the main results, where one main takeaway is that most of the factors in the main model from chapter 4 are significant and on multiple types of civilian targeting. It makes sense that they're not significant across all of them because these are different types of violence with unique logics behind them. These are not robustness checks of chapter 4. These are different analyses based on trying to understand these unique types of civilian targeting, which should have unique causal explanations behind each one of them. But nonetheless, in spite of the fact that they're all pretty unique types of violence, we see factors like rivalry, like alliances associated with multiple types of civilian targeting. So those are the main results. And I would just emphasize that what we show here, we're showing here because these are really robust with any of these types of violence, whether it's count, a dichotomous dependent variable, all sorts of different model specifications, zero inflated, negative binomial, OLS, different independent variables included. The results shown here are pretty robust. But I think with that, I will wrap up and let my colleague Karl take over. But thank you all again.
Great, thank you. Let me pull up my slides. Let's see, are you seeing my slides?
Yep, you look good.
Okay. Oops. Okay, so good morning. I'm going to take a bit of a deeper dive into the work that we've done.
Karl, you went back to not the full.
Okay, hold on. Yeah, I may have to stay in the other because I'm having a problem with this. Sorry, is that large enough to see as if I show it that way?
I think
Okay.
that looks fine. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. So as I mentioned, I'm going to take a deeper dive into our work on longitudinal modeling. And let me get to the first slide here. One of the key goals for the BAD project was to generate panel data on insurgent and terrorist organizations, both the organizational covariates and for the network data. And in our previous work, we'd studied the determinants of terrorist network structure using the BAD1 data, but BAD1 was a cross-section, so we could not study the processes of tie formation, tie persistence, or tie dissolution over time. So BAD2 was designed to fill that gap. So as you've heard, the BAD2 data covers 15 years from 1998 to 2012. For each year, we collected data on the alliance connections between the insurgent organizations that existed at that time. And so while our data contains a total of 140 organizations over those 15 years, there was substantial change in both the composition of the network and the structure of the network. In 1998, there were 76 active organizations, but by 2012, there are 108. But that 108 was a mix of organizations that persisted and those that sprang up over our study period. In fact, 19 of the 76 that were there in 1998 no longer functioned by 2012. And also the number of alliance ties grew substantially over the period from 20 to 61. But in each year, there was a creation, persistence, and dissolution of ties. So no fewer than 4 changes happened in any year and as many as 40. So our question was, what factors help to explain and govern the process of network formation and change? So to answer that question, we turned to a new modeling technique developed in the last 15 years, stochastic actor-oriented models, or SAOMs. SAOMs are simulation-based estimation techniques that model the dependence in the data as well as, excuse me, the effects of actor, in this case, organizational covariance. We used the RCNA package developed by Tom Schneiders for this project. When we began the project, our intent was to create a grand unified model of network change over time by including all 15 periods in a single model, and we did that analysis. However, SAOMs have really demanding criteria for model adequacy. The estimated model must converge, so that is, it has to be able to reproduce the underlying data after tens of thousands of simulations. It has to fit the data so that it has to be able to reproduce groups of microstructures. And it also has to show that the estimated coefficients are stable across time, and that is that there's no time heterogeneity. Our grand unified model passed the convergence test, but it failed the time heterogeneity test. So we made extensive efforts to parameterize for time heterogeneity, but in the end, we couldn't come up with a model that would converge effectively. So again, we consulted with Tom Schneiders, who's the godfather of this kind of analysis, and reached the conclusion that a single model could not be estimated. There were major differences not only in who participated in the network and the relationships they made, but also in the logics that guided the formation of networks across time. So following the advice that we got from Schneiders, we sought to segment the data into periods where the dynamics in the network were likely to be more consistent, but where there were clear discontinuities in the environment in which insurgent organizations operated. So after examining the data and using our sense of the time, we broke the data into 3 periods. Each period was modeled independently and each passed the time heterogeneity test. So our results suggest that the periods are consistent internally. What emerges is a more complex picture of the factors that explain network formation and change. So here are the periods that we established. The visualizations that you'll see in a second are a composite of the network relations during each of these periods. So the first period is pre-September 11th, 1998 to 2001. While the US and its allies were becoming more aware of terrorism and insurgency as a threat, those threats had not manifested in attacks on the US homeland yet. The network, as you can see, were quite small and stringy, and most organizations had few relationships. The second period is the post 9/11 period, 2002 to 2007. This period was the global war on terrorism, the invasion of Iraq, and the maximum US and allied counterterrorism and counterinsurgency effort that featured coercive responses in most cases. So the network at this time was much more elaborated and interconnected than before 9/11, but as we'll see in a second, there are reason to believe that the formation of network ties over this period of time was actually inhibited. The final period we labeled the post-surge period, referencing the change in tactics that followed the US drawdown in Iraq and what some have called the US pivot to classic counterinsurgency strategies in Iraq and elsewhere. The new Obama administration was also de-emphasizing coercive CT and CI strategies, creating a somewhat more permissive environment for insurgent organizations. And as you can see, the network post-surge was much larger, much more mature, and much more interconnected. So what did we find from our modeling? It turns out that there are some commonalities across our 3 periods in terms of factors that drive network formation and persistence. Insurgent networks in all periods tend to be small and low density. Only a few possible relationships are realized. Those relations that form tend to be closed to foster trust and to allow for co-monitoring of behavior among allies. Alliances usually form in the same country. So there are some far-flung networks that exist, but they're rare and likely due to the dangers of maintaining long-distance relationships and the difficulty of cooperating from afar. Those types of relationships over long distances generally don't occur. And the most popular partners are those that have demonstrated capacity. In our data, social service providing insurgents had more relationships, probably because offering these services is a proxy for overall organizational capacity and competence. Some factors were consistent across 2 concurrent periods. So one example was the prevalence of ties among terror users from 1998 to 2007. We examined diffusion and homophily as possible explanations. The evidence for both of those explanations was thin. Instead, using terror during this period seemed to again be a marker of success and capacity, and thus a draw for ties. During the 2002 to 2012 period, a time of very greatly increased CT and CI effort, several factors became important. Insurgents began to branch out, making relationships at home, but also in contiguous countries. The preference for ideological homophily that we saw in our Bad One analysis of terrorist organizations also finally showed up in the form of preferential links between ethno-nationalists. Older insurgent organizations became relatively shy about making new relationships, probably in response to the CT and CI pressure and wisdom about the liability of newness with respect to operational security. And state-sponsored organizations tend to ally. Sponsors may also have played a matchmaking role during this period. There are another set of factors that were important before 9/11 and also after the surge. The first factor was that organizations subject to coercive CT and CI were more likely to seek alliances before 9/11 and after the surge, but not during the period of highest coercive CT and CI directly after 9/11. Having more friends was dangerous during that period. The drug trade was also a factor, but in very divergent ways. Before 9/11, drug trafficking made an organization less desirable as a partner, and after the surge, it was the basis of relational formation. The difference may be the relative need to secure resources after the CT and CI efforts had increased after the 9/11 attack. There are also some idiosyncrasies that are specific to period. So during the post 9/11 period, organizations based in countries that use political terror were less likely to create relations, and those organizations that had not built alliances tended not to make them during this period. CT and CI and political terror both seem to suppress relational formation. After the surge, networks grew and were more likely to form chains. Religious homophily became more important as Islamically inspired organizations came to dominate, but big insurgent organizations tended not to make connections. So in closing, our analysis found a much more complex and messy process for network formation than what we had originally expected. While there's some enduring features of how insurgents make relationships, the context of these moments seem to strongly influence what matters. It does appear that CT and CI efforts and the nature of those efforts can substantially affect how networks form and change. Before 9/11, insurgents formed small networks with sparse ties and closed relationships, mostly in their home country, to organizations with demonstrated capacity and also a demonstrated desire to avoid CT and CI. After 9/11, organizations hunkered down and slowed their relational formation, but still the number of connections grew and became more complex as organizations sought to survive the US and Allied pressure during the War on Terror. After the surge, larger, more complex, and more mature networks emerged. Ideology became a key driver of relational formation, but so was the experience of the previous period of intense CT-CI and the need for information and resources during that period. With that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I think I'll turn it back over to Gary.
Okay, thank you so much, team, for the presentation. We already have several questions in the Q&A, and maybe I'll kick things off with the first question here. Your book examines the years 1998 to 2012, of course, so this 15-year period, but at least in terms of terrorism, there was, I think, a kind of specific tendency during this period to see a big increase. In the GTD anyway, it's the biggest increase we've clocked in a half century. And I realize this is speculation, but you guys are very informed in this area to speculate. Do you have any reason to think that your results would differ a good deal if you were looking at a very different sort of trajectory for terrorism during the period, like say the period right before when terrorism was relatively flat, or a period say in the 1970s when it was increasing, but the actors were a very different cast of characters?
So I think that different time periods can have very different situations in terms of what is causing terrorism and who is conducting it. And so I think that changes in what's going on in the world and who's trying to take leadership can really change what's happening. So for example, if we go back to the 1960s, Gary, religious terrorism would not be something that would be a huge motivator for a lot of organizations, although a lot of organizations were still committing terrorism, and that has changed over the years. So I do think that, in 5 years when, Gary, you give us a big grant to collect more data, it is possible that some of our, I don't think all of our findings, some of our findings I think would be robust across time periods, but I think some would definitely change. given the given world circumstances and what people are focusing on.
Okay. All right, thanks for that. So we had one quick question that didn't come in the Q&A, but came into the chat, but I think it was the very first one that I registered. This one's from Jason Grove. And Jason says, is there a parity between non-state actors killing civilians and those conducting other violence towards civilians, such as mass detainment, etc.?
Brian or Karl, do you want to answer that, or you want me to give a shot at it?
I can at least take a little start, which if I could, I'll take a start. So I think what the question is asking is about an equivalence between non-state actors and state actors doing what they do, unless it's about just the tactics. Is killing civilians comparable to other types of violence against civilians? And I would just suggest, as I'm sure others can in great detail, that it's that there was no normative. There was no normative evaluation by ourselves to say that this type of violence against civilians is more important than states killing civilians or whatever states do. Just that these are different types of violence with different logics behind them. And we looked at this and found this particular explanation, but I'm sure, looking at state actions towards civilians, there'd be different logics and different consequences as well.
Okay, thank you. I think you all can monitor the questions in the Q&A too, so if you want to actually see them in print as well, we can follow along. The next one I have is from Dale Pankhurst, who he says he's a PhD candidate at Queen's University, Belfast. And the question is this: do you think other non-state armed groups that are loyal to the state and or government, i.e. pro-government militias or pro-state militaries, influence how and why insurgent organizations target civilians?
Brian, were you about to say something?
I can, unless you want to go.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
It looked like you were about to say something.
Sure. No, I think they should. I think pro-government militias should have an important impact in relationships between insurgents, and pro-government militias should have an important impact, as some work has shown. We didn't look at that. We didn't explicitly model that ourselves, but that would be a good path for future research, because as some people have shown that, yes, those interactions, those relationships are important as well.
Yeah, so to follow on what Brian just said, this is something that, we need the resources to collect this kind of data for pro-government militias that are not often seen in the same way as insurgent organizations that challenge governments. But again, and I know this guy who knows something about network relations, we have seen that alliances and rivals have, rivalry has a big impact. And so if you include these pro-government militias that are fundamentally rivals of these organizations, it is going to have an impact.
Just to follow on that, the nature of rivalry, as we have another chapter that addresses rivalry, which we haven't talked about here today. Rivalry is important in some of the analyses that you saw a few minutes ago, but it operates by very fundamentally different rules than the alliances that we talked about. The rivalries that we are able to analyze, which are among non-state actors, tend to be very stringy. They tend to be dyadic. There don't tend to be complexes of rivalry in the same way, although there are some small complexes that you find, for instance, with respect to Israel and Palestine. The question, I think, with respect to insurgent militia relationships would be the degree to which those organizations view each other as rivals, and the degree to which they are vying for similar groups of people in terms of trying to get civilians to be supporters of their particular brand of insurgency or support for the government that they are engaged with. But the things that I talked about with respect to, and the approaches that we took with respect to analyzing alliances, really can't be used on rivalries because they're such a different animal in terms of how they form and how they interact with each other.
Okay, thank you. So next we have a more technical question. My spinner just moved on its own here, lost me. From Tanya Marie Hansen, who says, how do you handle the large amount of unclaimed and often also unattributed attacks in the database? Research has previously suggested that claiming should be less likely for attacks striking civilians, which would, at least theoretically, skew your measure of the number of terrorist groups per year.
Karl, you want to answer that one?
Sure. So we work directly with the counts that were in the GTD as they for the ones that were attributed. In the absence of a way of making an attribution, there was really no way to move beyond what the GTD had provided us with respect to the attribution of these attacks. I think in the absence of having some way of trying to separate those out, I'm not sure there was another way that we could have included those or try to account for that directly. I don't know if Brian or Victor, you have another answer to that.
I think that the fundamental issue with social science when collecting data, we can't do an experiment of killing civilians in our classrooms, thank goodness. And so we've got to use the data that's available. And a lot of the time, the data that's available has missing components. And we're aware of that. And we do talk about that in the book. But there are things, if we can't code it, we can't code it. And we may be missing something, but we can't fix that with data that simply is not codable. I'm also seeing here that Aaron Copeland would like to answer this question. I don't know.
No, sorry, that's just Zoom's fault.
Okay.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure, Aaron.
Okay,
If you have a
so
different answer, Aaron, I'd love to hear it.
so our next question is from Emmanuel Didier. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Emmanuel. How do you characterize or analyze genocidal terrorism against Yazidis, Assyrians, etc. by ISIS?
So, of course, now somebody is calling my my phone, which is why you hear that noise in the background. I apologize. But actually, just why don't you want to answer this while I turn this call
Sure,
off?
yeah. So genocidal terrorism would count as terrorism. Maybe we should have done a chapter on genocidal terrorism in particular, because it's certainly an important type of terrorism, but we did not. But that would fall under terrorism. That's an important type of terrorism based on a particular ethnic group.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Our next question is from Imrana Al-Haji Buba, who says, I wonder if you explore insurgents' targeting of self-defense militias, or how self-defense militias instigate targeting of civilian populations.
So I think the answer is no, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this again, there are a whole list, and this is on the list. Self-defense militias and pro-government militias are on a list of what we'd like to collect data on, but we have not had the opportunity to do that as of yet. But it is an important question, we agree.
Okay, we have a compound question from Herbert Tinsley. Hi, Herbert, haven't talked to you in a while. He has several parts here. He says, first, how did you ensure that the attacks in the data were indeed attacks on members of the general public?
Well, let's answer that one first, Gary.
Okay.
Because the answer is easy. It's all Gary Lafree's fault.
Or the GTD team, anyway. I'll fob it off on.
Okay, so like I said, Gary Lafree's fault. So we use the GTD is an excellent database, and that is what we use to do the decisions about what we're coding and what we're not coding.
And this is, of course, I think, speaking for the GTD, a very thorny issue to code for, and I think they do an excellent job, but it's it's far from perfect. Next, Herbert says, how did you account for insurgent perceptions of alleged civilian targets which they may have chosen because of those targets' believed affiliation with the state, such as worship locations that are favored by military and their families, schools that serve families for government bureaucrats, etc.
Yeah, if I could respond, that's something that with trying to do a large scale quantitative exercise, we weren't able to be 100% sure that we were only looking at random civilians. And in fact, I'm sure there were incidents in there where civilians were targeted because of an affiliation with the state. And so some of that is in there. Having looked at a lot of the cases one at a time, I don't think it's a majority of the cases or a large number, but that is one issue with the data that some of these civilians fall in that category. And in some future research, it would be interesting and valuable to try to go through attack by attack and determine, where which attacks are on relatively random civilians who are unaffiliated with any state actor or another insurgent organization, for example. But we didn't go through that sort of micro detail on this project.
And Herbie's final question actually is one that I was sort of thinking of a different version of this, because it gets to, who should be included as the public and who should not be. He says, if these attacks are meant to cause victim audiences to fear they could be killed anywhere, how is this type of terrorism different than the targeting of military or government personnel in places where they have a relative expectation of safety?
I can try that one as well. The idea is a difference there between attacking an off-duty military personnel and a civilian, as opposed to a non-combatant, would be, someone might say that it could be argued that an off-duty military personnel still has some degree of legitimate status as a target, not according to the Geneva Conventions, but whereas a civilian who is not in the military at all has sort of a different status and is more obviously, you could say, a non-combatant. So attacking a member of the military when they're out of their uniform, some civilian might say, well, they're fortunately only attacking members of the military, so they're not going to attack me. So we do see some distinction there.
Yeah, I find this an interesting one, because I find that the political scientists using the GTD often define it the way you are. Criminologists often then don't. I mean, they usually include attacks on police. And so anyway. Next question is from Autumn Dawn Perky, who says, how does embeddedness impact the types of violence that insurgent groups participate in? Does embeddedness in the public result in the reduction of certain types of violence? Here I'm thinking about sexual and gender-based violence. To further this, does embeddedness affect group norms surrounding the acceptable level of violence towards civilians?
So I can take part of this one, and then maybe Brian will want to add to this. So I think the things that we found is that there are important relationship effects from ideological affiliations, from the way that organizations gather capacity, and that organizations, when they're embedded in broader networks, are looking for partners that are going to have both additional capacity and additional knowledge. So what we didn't have either the data for or any success in modeling so far was to find some of these questions about transmission of norms. So the data that we had didn't show a lot of evidence for diffusion, partly because some of the things that we looked for with respect to diffusion, like for instance, the diffusion of use of certain types of terrorism, there were not enough instances where an organization entered into the data without already having either known how to use a particular technique or having been exposed to it in some previous period. So I think it's completely possible that there is a social component to the movement of these kinds of norms across networks, but our data was not sufficient to try to pull that together specifically. And when we looked at propagation of techniques, and the data that we have right now, the pre-existing spread of some of these techniques was sufficiently broad that we really couldn't pin it back to diffusion directly. So I think it matters, but I can't prove it currently.
Okay, thanks, Karl. Our next question is from the director of START, Bill Braniff. Good morning, Bill. Good to have you on board here. And this one's directed specifically to Brian. Bill says, can you speak to any pragmatic CT-CI policy implications regarding your findings about violence against the general public or the more specific targets of schools, hospitals, and journalists?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. One thing that we found to be really important, and I believe all of these, was the alliance relationships among insurgent organizations. So this, I think, just points to the importance of breaking up relationships among insurgent organizations, because it seems to be associated with these other types of behaviors, whether through learning or whether through increased capacity. So that might be helpful. Also, democracy seemed to be important for attacks on journalists in particular, and some other environmental factors. So at the very least, I think policymakers could look at these results to anticipate where attacks against journalists or attacks against schools might be more likely in the future, to try to maybe focus on particular types of environments to try to anticipate these types of violence.
And can I add to that, Brian?
Sure.
I think there's another key element here, which is the impact of stick, right? So if a government is choosing to use a stick strategy against these organizations, it increases generally the likelihood of attacks against civilians, but it also against the general public and attacks against schools. And states, when they're choosing what strategies to choose, should have a clear sense of what the impact of that strategy is going to be. And carrot reduces the number of attacks against civilians. So it's worth, yeah, Brian?
No, just to follow up and agree, and related to the question about how some of these apparently general public targets could be seen as indicators of the government. Schools might be attacked because they're symbols of the government to some degree. So maybe that's why there's repression, and after repression, attacks on schools.
So yes, what the government is doing, one of our key findings is what the government is doing towards this organization is having an important impact for how that organization behaves and who they attack.
Okay, thanks. So Bill had a quick follow-up with the same question, but this time for Karl. What are the policy implications of the network analysis, would you say, for CT?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things to learn from the modeling that we've done so far. One is that, and it comes out more strongly in some additional analysis that we've done after this project and this book on our broader terrorism data set. That is, it's very important to understand newly formed organizations and the trajectory they're likely to take in terms of their creation of network relationships. We now have shown, both in the terrorism research that we've done and in this insurgent research that we've done, that alliances help to facilitate a lot of different types of bad behavior. There are some clearer indications in the terrorism analyses that we've done, and some indication, especially for the post 9/11 period in the insurgent analysis, that it's possible to set up strategies to try to keep isolates isolated, to inhibit their formation of relationships, that increasingly those inhibitions need to be through cyber methods, because the initial contacts are happening not in the physical world, but in cyber context, and that continuing to try to find ways to, as Victor suggested, use carrots to keep organizations from reaching out for additional help, as opposed to necessarily turning immediately to coercive suppression of organizations, is important. If organizations can be kept from forming larger networks, they tend to be less capable and they tend to be less likely to engage. So thinking carefully about how to keep them in this isolate state is a really important thing, I think, to follow up on in additional research.
Well, we have hit the 11 o'clock mark now, panel, and we had still a couple of questions that we didn't get to, but perhaps if it's possible, maybe you can respond to those in writing, answer them, or typing in an answer.
Would you be
'cause I want
okay,
to,
Gary, if I just gave a really quick answer verbally?
yeah, of course, go ahead.
Okay, so for M. Ryder asks, what's the impact of insurgent or terrorist organizations on bureaucratic developments that increase? And what we can say here is that if organizations are providing social services, it actually increases their likelihood of attacks on civilians. And if they control territories, it specifically increases their attacks on journalists. So yes, it is having an impact. And Eleda, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Eleda. Should we expect to see different forms of alliances having different effects on civilian targeting? Some are more formalized and some are not. Karl, you want to give a one-sentence answer to that?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is less about formal versus informal, which I can't give you a specific answer to, but more that we have found in different types of analytics that the nature of the complex of relations that they build, we use different types of centrality measures to try to capture that. So sometimes it's the count of alliances, sometimes it's how interconnected they are. So it really comes back to the broader microstructure, I think, than the formal versus informal in terms of its effects on the mechanism for both diffusion and for the influence that it has on choices to attack certain types of targets.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. I think you can tell based on the questions that there's a good deal of interest in the materials being covered in this book. Again, want to encourage you all to get your copy and to look at these issues in much greater detail. And I want to thank our panelists and all of the participants, and thanks for all the great questions you submitted. I think we'll leave it at that. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Gary. And thank you, Aaron and Eva, and definitely the captioner, Jen. Thanks.
Very good.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye.